Hey guys, it's the Melblade5, and unlike the rest of the internet, I actually like Fairy Tail, and I will still proclaim that a lot of the big reasons why people say it sucks are blown way out of proportion or are hypocritical when compared to other anime. But that's not exactly what this video is about, cause we got a game now. When this game was spontaneously announced, I was pretty excited for it. Well, when I saw the Koei Tecmo logo, I thought it was going to be a Muso game, which made me think, have I predicted the future again? But even when later learning that it was an RPG instead, it didn't change my anticipation for it. What also excited me was the fact that this is the first Fairy Tail game to be released internationally. There were a few for the DS and PSP, but only in Japan. And with Fairy Tail having a massive cast of characters with different, mostly unique and often highly destructive types of magic, I felt the series would translate into games very well and felt giddy to finally play as them myself. And despite a lot of people losing interest upon it being confirmed to be a turn-based RPG rather than an action one, that didn't affect my views at all, as I generally prefer turn-based anyway. And then they announced that this game would primarily feature the Grand Magic Games and the Tartaros arc, the latter being my favorite arc in the whole series, making me even more excited. However, I was also cautiously optimistic, as I knew that anime games tend to be lacking in quality and cheaply made, so I was concerned that this game would follow suit. There have been several anime games before for series I like, such as the My Hero Academia one's Justice games, which I didn't end up buying because of their poor quality. But Fairy Tail didn't appear to necessarily be going in that direction from all the pre-release stuff I saw, so I ended up getting the game. Specifically, I got the PS4 version, which I was worried would be censored due to Sony's stupid censorship crap, but that surprisingly wasn't the case. So this is now my first proper anime game, and that's precisely why I wanted to make this video, to present the perspective of a newcomer into this field, whilst giving my impressions of the game itself since I beat it several months ago, with the things I liked and the things I didn't. As soon as I entered a non-battle environment, I started rummaging through the menus to see the options, and was really surprised to see just how much lore they included here. They had all the terminology and what they mean, bios for all the characters, with even characters like Igneos being available from the start, and they even had a synopsis for every arc that occurred before the point where the game begins. They went out of their way to ensure that anybody playing this game who has never seen or read Fairy Tail can be caught up to speed and understand all the necessary details. I like how they accounted for that. Though I will say that I think people who have seen Fairy Tail before will get a lot more enjoyment out of this game than those who haven't. But as for the exact beginning of the game, it kicks off with the battle against Hades at the end of the Tenro Island arc, which I find funny to think that the developers looked at this fight and thought, you know what? Tutorial fight. This is where you get taught about the battle system, which is very easy to understand when seen in action. And the gameplay itself is definitely the biggest positive for this game. While I do think the battle system could have been a bit more fleshed out, I also think it's pretty underrated. Enemies are placed across a 3x3 grid, and your magic attacks hit specific squares in this grid, ranging from a single square to L shapes and even going up entire rows or columns, with which then you can select your target and potentially hit multiple enemies depending on your choice. Attacks that cover multiple squares can also do more damage than other squares, so placement is key. What's also crucial is that all magic attacks have an element, some having two, with these elements being normal, fire, water, wind, light, dark, and demonic. Every enemy has their own weakness, and most also have resistances or even immunities to certain elements, which applies to every party member too. Well, most of them. Hitting an enemy with their weakness or getting a critical hit will send them into a break state, where they will be unable to do anything when their turn comes around. This makes every battle feel like a puzzle of sorts, as you ideally have to hit every enemy with their weakness to stun them and leave any remaining ones open for you to destroy them. Which happens most of the time, as this game is pretty easy overall. I do think the break state is a little too overpowered given how easy it is to achieve, so it can make you win most fights without getting hit, unless you're fighting the wolf enemies. I hate fighting these things. They take up 2 squares, but they act twice in a row, and pretty much always go first, even if you get a speed up from a first strike in the overworld. I also kinda don't like how the combat is effectively all about your magic attacks that consume NP, as your standard attack does very little damage. But fortunately, you get a bit of an MP recovery every time you kill an enemy. In addition to how strong your spells usually are, you also have the Fairy Tale gauge, which when filled up lets you initiate a magic chain. This is all active party members perform magic attacks on all the enemies in continuous succession up to the current maximum, or if you select a finisher, ignoring all enemy affinities and treating it as if you're hitting their weakness. At certain points, the finisher for the chain will be replaced with extreme magic that has another character like Makarov or Kana perform a super powerful spell. This has gotten me out of a pinch a bunch of times, but from my experience, it can be a little random on how far in the chain you can go up to, as it's based on how much damage you do, but sometimes you can just not do enough to get closer to the maximum despite using the same characters on the same enemies, which made some parts of the map that require you to use the overdamage mechanic to reach a pain in the ass, especially those with very steep requirements. Lastly, there is the awakening mechanic. Every time a character is hit, their awakening meter fills up slightly. When another character attacks, some of this meter can be spent for them to perform a follow-up on the same enemies that also ignores their affinities, which is very helpful. But if it fills up all the way, that character can enter an awakening state, where for the next 3 turns, a big chunk of their HP and MP are restored. This can even be activated during an enemy's turn to cancel their attack at the cost of having 1 less turn in effect. And they even went the extra mile for this. Some characters also have multiple awakening options. For example, Natsu starts off with either Dragon Force for his standard awakening, or Lightning Fire Dragon mode. The latter and all others of this type give the character additional spells whilst active, but only their HP is recovered each turn, so there's a trade-off. Everything about this mechanic has been a godsend for me for tougher enemies and boss battles. But on the subject of that, one major issue I have with the gameplay is the boss battles. Most of the bosses in this game are really lame and honestly a chore to fight. The majority of boss fights are just one-on-one battles. Not only does this suck out a lot of the fun and interesting aspects of the battle system as you're only using one party member and fighting only one person with no additional enemies in sight, but it also ends up being a war of attrition. For all these types of boss fights, I just spammed 1 or 2 moves for the entire fight while the boss retaliates with a small range of attacks to choose from, with me using the occasional healing item or awakening to recover, and the magic chain just to speed things up until they were dead. This is an instance where I say the game stays too close to the source material, as while these are one-on-one fights in the anime and manga, they don't translate well to game design as they just become boring. I think they should have taken some creative liberty and given you a few extra characters for this to make it more interesting, or at least give you and the boss more strategies to do. Even with the bosses where you have multiple characters, a lot of those aren't much more exciting because of them also having few attacks to use and some of them feeling like tutorials. The only bosses in this game that really felt like bosses were Future Rogue with the Mother Glare, the final boss battle against Marred Gear, and the fight against Ikasa Tsunagi during the Epilogue. Regardless of that issue, I think that battles overall can get pretty fun when you get into the swing of things, and especially with the right characters. You end up with a fairly large party at the end of everything, with 16 playable characters, and a decent chunk of them being those from other guilds. They are Natsu, Lucy, Gray, Urza, Wendy, Juviaw, Gajiel, Sting, Rogue, Kagura, Shelia, Ichiya, Man, Mirajane, Loxus, Jalal, and Gildarts as a sort of secret character after finishing the epilogue. I think this is a great selection of characters, even though there are a few others who I would have liked to have seen playable like Yukino. And I'm a bit bummed we didn't get Cobra so we could have all the Dragon Slayers here. In fact, Cobra doesn't even appear in the game at all. I was really surprised to see that all the characters from other guilds are optional to recruit, and Mira and Loxus can't be recruited until just before the final chapter. This links back to my issue with the boss fights. I think if most of these characters were recruited through the main story, then they could have been used for some of those bosses to make them more interesting. Instead, the game encourages you to use Team Natsu for the majority of the story. At certain points, you're even locked into using members of that group. sometimes with a guest character who is AI controlled. I would have liked to have used characters outside of Team Natsu much more than I actually did, but that team just had the most synergy from all their uses to the story, partly due to the bonding mechanic. This reminds me a lot of support conversations in Fire Emblem. After two characters fight and do quests together enough, they have the opportunity to deepen their bonds, which increases their rank with each other and provides buffs in combat when those two are in the active party. There are also conversation scenes between both characters. Unfortunately, this is limited to Fairy Tail members and mostly among themselves, however. I understand that it would be really hard to come up with dialogue for every single combination, but there are some pairs who bafflingly don't have conversations. I mean, Sting and Rogue don't talk to each other. Like, they have the almost gay bromance. Why not? Lastly, on the subject of the party, there is also a rank-up mechanic that now reminds me of Persona a bit. Using points accumulated from a quest, you can have characters rank up to learn new abilities. Some of these upgrades are shared across all characters' pathways, like getting an extra Lacrima slot and getting a new move when maxing out, but each character also has abilities unique to them, and I really like how they tied some of these in with that character's traits. For example, Gray can lose his clothes upon getting hit, which makes him stronger, and Juviaw gets some skills with a slightly greater chance to activate when with Gray. I've brought up requests several times now, so I guess I should go into that feature. Requests act as side quests for this game. Before getting it, I did look up several reviews because I was still a bit skeptical, and they all mentioned this part being repetitive, and I understand what they mean. All of the generic requests are just to kill a certain number of a specific enemy, which isn't that bad on its own, but they give you so many before you're done with all the ones at that rank that it gets tiresome so quickly. I only did these during the early parts of the game for grinding and when you have to for increasing the guild rank. Once the unique requests opened up, I only did those because I was getting enough experience from both those and story progression perfectly fine, which made this aspect of the game much more bearable for me. These types of requests, where you are often required to use certain characters, are much more fleshed out since they can have multiple objectives that aren't just kill these enemies, as well as a small narrative around them. Plus, you get much better rewards out of them. I did every single one of these that were available to me during the main story. Additionally, there are a few requests and other side missions that actually reference events that only happened in the anime. While I haven't seen this one myself, I've heard there's a request that references Daphne, and another one even references that one filler episode where Ichiya creates a zombie apocalypse of himself. I lost my mind when I did this request and realized what they were doing because I love that episode for how stupidly funny it is. This is what I mean when I say that I think people who've experienced Fairy Tail before will get a lot more enjoyment out of this, because these kinds of references will just go over everyone else's heads. I love that they went the extra mile to do this sort of thing, and it gives the impression that the developers did have some genuine passion when making this, which makes the weaker sides of how the game is displayed all the more disappointing. This takes me over to what is arguably my biggest criticism of the game, but is definitely the most notable one: the presentation. This left me with a lot to be desired. For the positives in this area, all the CG pre-rendered cutscenes look great. It feels like they were able to properly convert the show's animation into 3D. And I'd say that most of the character models are pretty good, not amazing though. Plus, we also have fan service! It wouldn't be Fairy Tail without that! But after that, this game's graphics aren't very good. As soon as I stepped out of the rundown guild for the first time, I was like, oh no. The environments have a lot of blurry textures that look like something from a PS2 game at best. And while the towns look a lot better, there are some instances of it there too. I first noticed this with the staircase in Magnolia. I know graphics aren't the most important part of a game, but this isn't the only case where the presentation is lacking. Another big issue I have is that not every character who appears in the game has a model. This is most notable with most of Lucy's spirits being presented as cut-in portraits, and when you begin the Grand Magic Games, as there's tons of empty space with many of the competitors being absent. And when someone has to talk with a person without a model, they just position the camera in such a way that it's implied they are just off screen, which is really awkward. The only real exception to this is when Urza's talking to Miliana, where they use an original illustration of her, which I wish they did more of if they really couldn't make more models. Every other time they do something like this, they just use screenshots from the anime. In fact, this game does that a lot, namely during these transition scenes where Lucy explains what's going on. Similar to the bonding conversations, I understand that they likely couldn't make models for every single relevant character that appears in these arcs, but there are some characters who really should have models, but don't, such as Ivan and Gemma, for example. They're both shit villains, but their absences rob the opportunity of any or a proper boss fight against them that could have been interesting. There are so many areas that are lacking in polish. While not so much a presentation thing, some of the attack animations are pretty long and you can't skip them, which drags things on. Like, most of Ichi's attacks take forever to do with very little payoff, and with spells like Uranometria, you could just get up, make a sandwich, and it would still be going by the time you're finished. I also noticed quite a few grammatical errors in the dialogue. I can't remember any specifics right now, but there was one instance so bad it completely fucked up the sentence and made me laugh. Characters only have one portrait for their text boxes, which I didn't think about at first until getting to future Lucy's death scene, where Happy is supposed to be crying his eyes out, but in his portrait he's still, well, happy. Another example is how you can unlock the Sky Sisters song for Wendy and Shelia, but they don't sing anything. They just mouth into the microphone. Man, they should collab with peers from Pokemon sometime. And on a similar note to that, some of the characters without models also don't have any voice acting. So when they're in a scene with full voice acting, there's just this awkward silence when they appear. We must stop Zeref at all costs. What say you? I couldn't agree more. You have such a way with words. Well, since we've gone into that territory now, it's about time I mention that this game only has Japanese voice acting. There's no English dub, which I know some people are disappointed about, but it honestly doesn't bother me, because while I watched 93.9% of Fairy Tail and both movies dubbed, I hate Funimation and most of their voice actors for what they did to Vic Mignogna, as well as just being all-around assholes, so them not getting paid is A-okay with me! Even if Natsu's Japanese voice can get pretty grating when he screams. That's everything I really needed to say about the general overview stuff. Now is where I want to go over how I felt they handled the two main arcs, which I don't have much to say about anyway, as this game is surprisingly short for an RPG, but there are still things I want to discuss. So aside from my issues with the presentation and how it affected this part, I think the Grand Magic games were adapted pretty well. Not that much about this arc was greatly changed or completely removed, and aside from, again, some of the boss fights, I had a very fun time when I wasn't thinking over my criticisms. With the Tartaros arc, however, I was left somewhat disappointed. It felt like this arc was an afterthought, as despite also being one of the longest arcs in the series, it only accounts for a third of the main game, and that's only when going off of the number of chapters it gets. To me, it felt even shorter than that, which really saddened me because, as I said before, this is my favorite arc, and I was so looking forward to getting to this part when starting. Some moments I really like from this arc are completely cut or shortened, partly due to the fact that almost half of the Tartaros members don't have models, so you don't fight them. Even though this arc has a lot of cool fights when it comes to both action and personal narrative, which is part of why I love it so much. On the other hand, I did get enjoyment out of most of what they did feature from this arc, it just wasn't as much as what I had hoped. Such as the Marred Gear battle, obviously, Urza and Kyoka's final battle, Lucy unlocking her Stardress powers and destroying Jackal, Wendy achieving Dragon Force, Gray fighting Silver with his whole "I am your father," followed by Gray getting his Devil Slayer magic. Though again, there were still some parts I felt were lacking, like the scene where Lucy has to break Aquarius' key, which is a really sad scene in the anime, but here it felt so rushed, like, we gotta get a move on, people. as well as Igneal's death, which also lacked a lot of the emotion that was seen in the anime. As for that final battle against Mard Gear, as I said earlier, I definitely think it's one of the better boss fights, and is actually pretty challenging too. But I do think it goes on a bit too long. He has 3 phases, with many attacks being shared between them. First, he's sitting in his chair, then he's standing up! Ooh! And lastly, you fight him in his Furious form, where the real challenge kicks in. Namely when he uses Memento Mori, which does almost half your health and inflicts you with every status condition. But I beat him on my first try. And then came the ending and credits. However, there is still the epilogue, which I knew was coming since some of the guild upgrades specify you have to be at that part to make them. Initially, I thought it was just going to be the scene of Natsu and Lucy reuniting 1 year later, and then it would just cut to once Fairy Tail has been restored and be like, now just do what you want. But instead, the epilogue actually covers parts of the Avatar arc. I was not expecting them to directly go into the final season, so it was a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. Even if it is a very abridged version of that arc, which was already a short one to begin with. I know some people were also disappointed that this game doesn't cover the Alvarez Empire arc too, but I had some issues with that arc. The only thing I'd really miss from it is Brandish, because yeah. For some reason, they felt like having such a massive difficulty spike here after the rest of the game being pretty easy, as enemies in the new areas you unlock, and a bunch of those in the previous ones too, were suddenly over 20 levels higher than me now. So they do tons of damage! I especially hate Mount Zonia. It's so awkward to navigate with the tight passageways and all the enemies are brutal. But I managed. Usually by running away. So then it ends off with getting Makarov back whilst acting like Alvarez doesn't exist, unlocking the S-Class trials that have you fight a strong boss, and be granted permission to take on S-Class requests for everyone who passes. Once I reached this point, and I got the pop-up telling me the story has been completed, I felt it was a good time to stop. I didn't feel like doing any S-Class requests at the time, and wanted to move on to finishing another RPG I got around the same time that I plan on making a video for next. I may go back and recruit Guildarts to have a play around of him, since he is available to me now, but I finished all the story and felt somewhat accomplished for this game's standards. I know I've been sounding very negative for most of this video, which would make you think I hate it, but when it comes to the things I like about this game, I actually like them quite a bit. I think most of the gameplay and the battle system in both concept and general execution is pretty fun. The fan service is great, as in the references to things fans would know, not just the boobies. And while I didn't have a good opportunity to bring this up earlier, the music is great too. They unfortunately couldn't get any of the music from the anime, not even Dragon Force, but the music here sounds like something you would hear in the anime anyway. But the issues I have with this game also stick out like a sore thumb. The presentation's pretty bad, requests can get boring quickly, and most of the boss fights are monotonous. Upon finishing the final chapter, it felt kinda like I finished a beta version of a game rather than the final product, with how there's a lot of missed potential and things that feel unfinished. It just screams rushed development and or a limited budget. Which is a shame since it does feel like the developers legitimately cared, but maybe couldn't do as much as they wanted, possibly due to higher up interference. There is DLC too, but I'm not gonna bother with that at all, as I don't think the stuff you get is really worth it, and it's so expensive! It costs just as much as the game itself! They also made things like the final season designs DLC, when I think that should have been in the game from the beginning given the epilogue. I guess if this game somehow got a sequel that does cover Alvarez, then they could fix some of my criticisms, assuming they have more of a budget, since all the playable characters here and a bunch of others are involved in that arc in some form. But I highly doubt this game sold enough to warrant a sequel. To end this off, I personally say that this game is okay-ish, but it will probably be straight up bad if you haven't seen Fairy Tail. If you actually do consider getting it, I definitely suggest waiting for a lower price. I don't regret playing the game, but it did leave me with some disappointment. Well, that seems to follow suit what I heard about anime games in the first place.